Reborn to the moment with the work incentive voucher. I relinquished my outstanding worker title to Emma White. Jonathan, now looking over 30 years younger, opened his mouth and called me Emma. His thin-skinned personality and soft nature had caused him to fail in interviews before. Hearing him say Emma White's name always came with a sticky, ambiguous tone. I wasn't furious just yet. This time, if he failed to secure the election, his family would pressure him into marriage. I had returned to the time after Jonathan and I were introduced through matchmaking, only to stumble upon him and Emma White acting intimately. The day Jonathan came to confess, he said, "If you're willing to step aside, I'll marry you." His words were hauntingly identical to those from my previous life. Back then, I was livid. Without hesitation, I raised my hand and slapped him across the face, sending his glasses crashing to the ground where they shattered. His pale, delicate face instantly turned beet red. "You slapped me, Sarah," Jonathan exclaimed, incredulous. "With your ridiculous face, you still think you can seduce someone?" I retorted, "I'm hitting you because you're a shameless hypocrite." Rolling up my sleeves, I raised my hand again, determined to settle both old and new scores. Jonathan clutched his chest, visibly stunned. I was only missing a proper weapon. If I had one, I might have sent him straight to meet Karl Marx. Just then, Emma White jumped out, yelling, "Sarah, you're insane. Somebody help. She's hitting people." I grabbed her braid and delivered another resounding slap, turning her face as red as a steamed peach. "I'm not just hitting him. I'm hitting you too," I declared. "Your so-called platonic love, I'll beat it into your skin, your spirit, and your soul until you both remember the unbearable pain of this life." Jonathan was almost blind without his glasses, unable to tell people from objects more than a few feet away. Emma White, a frail beauty, had barely stepped outside in her life. Dealing with the two of them was a breeze. When I grew tired, I clapped the dust off my hands and sneered, "You two really deserve each other. The next time you dare show off in front of me, I'll beat you again." Before leaving, I couldn't resist stomping on their faces one last time. I planned to head home to check on my father and sister. But behind me, Emma White cried out, "Sarah, I'm going to report you to the authorities." I laughed. "Go ahead. But if anyone asks why you got beaten up, do you even dare tell the truth?" Jonathan suddenly remembered the reason he came, to ask me to give up the outstanding worker title. He quickly grabbed Emma White's arm and muttered, "Emma, she shouldn't have hit us. But you need to let it go." "Let it go," Emma protested. "Why should she be allowed to hit me? On what grounds?" "On the grounds of your shamelessness," I snapped, my anger reigniting. "Jonathan, why don't you repeat what you just told your dear Emma White? Go on. Say it out loud if you dare." Cornered, Jonathan stammered and hesitated, his face looking as though it was being roasted over a fire. Finally, he mumbled, "I love Emma. I did it for you." I scoffed. I knew Jonathan all too well. His indecisiveness in matters of the heart had plagued him his entire past life. "For me? If it's for me, then why can't you be honest with me?" I retorted coldly. "Clearly, I don't even matter to you." Emma White, sensing an opportunity, pressed, "Jonathan, what do you mean? For me? Tell me now." Jonathan stuttered. I mean, for you. I agreed to marry Sarah, but I swear, it was all for you." Emma stood there, dumbfounded. I burst out laughing. "Oh, so this is how Jonathan shows his love for you. Emma, he loves you so much that he insists on marrying me? All for you? And you still think I shouldn't have beaten him?" Looking at them, I added mockingly, "You two pests really make the perfect pair. If you ever cross paths with me again, I swear I'll beat you both to death." At this point, Jonathan pointed at me furiously, yelling, "Sarah, you're nothing but a shrew. You'll never understand the bond Emma and I share. If it weren't for helping Emma win the outstanding worker title, I'd never have agreed to marry you. Forget everything I said before. You're not even worthy of marrying me. You'll never get me either." I spat. Emma White was instantly moved to tears, sobbing uncontrollably as she threw herself into Jonathan's arms. "Jonathan, I knew you were doing this for me," she cried, her voice soft and saccharine. "Emma, I sacrificed myself for you. My heart belongs only to you. No one else. Jonathan said tenderly, holding her close. I clapped my hands loudly. Bravo! That was beautiful. Did everyone hear that? Jonathan and Emma, still embracing, froze and turned around to see the factory manager, the workshop supervisor, and several co-workers who had just finished their shifts standing at the alley's entrance. Their faces were etched with disbelief and scorn. In my previous life, when Jonathan proposed marriage under similar circumstances, I had only paused in confusion for a moment before he hugged me tightly. He spoke of how he would treat me well, how we would get married, and how the outstanding worker title wasn't that important. Back then, I was an innocent young woman, unaccustomed to such close contact with a man. Besides, Jonathan was indeed considered a handsome and promising young man in the factory. In that moment, I forgot to push him away. Coincidentally, the factory manager had been passing by, pushing his broken bicycle. When he saw us, the situation was as ridiculous as a roasted duck refusing to die in peace. This time, because of the fight, I had no hope of keeping the outstanding worker title. Emma, pretending to cry, overheard that I had lost my qualification and couldn't hide her glee. However, when her tears smeared into one of her injuries, the pain made her wince, exposing her true feelings. Her delicate, sickly beauty turned into a busy performance of false sorrow and real discomfort. Jonathan couldn't help but chide the doctor. Be gentle. Emma's afraid of pain. Emma shot him a coquettish glance, which Jonathan returned with a gaze full of misplaced affection. The factory doctor was visibly disgusted. Even while being treated in the infirmary, they couldn't behave themselves. If they thought my blows were heavy, they should just go to the hospital. Outside the infirmary, a crowd of people pretending to be passing by gathered to watch the spectacle. So that's the infamous couple who got beaten up. Yeah, the woman isn't competent at work. So she sent her lover to seduce Sarah. Sarah couldn't take it and beat him up. And the woman? She got caught in the crossfire. Huh. Both of them got what they deserved. All for a title. Jonathan, the so-called genius, turned into a fool for her. They look so pitiful just now. And Jonathan still has the nerve to call himself single and try to date other women in the factory. Well, he's a genius. One isn't enough for him. He probably wants to pick and choose a few more. I knew these rumors would spread like wildfire through the factory. Public opinion had always been uncontrollable. But among the gossip, a few dissenting voices emerged. Emma White is pure and quiet. Maybe Sarah deliberately beat her out of jealousy. I think Jonathan and Sarah don't match. Sarah probably hit him because she's mad Jonathan didn't choose her. A young, beautiful female worker chimed in boldly, drawing attention from those around her. Her companion tugged at her sleeve, but she brushed it off nonchalantly. Just then, a commotion erupted outside the infirmary. Who dares bully my girl? The doorway darkened as a burly, broad-shouldered man stepped inside. Backlit by the sun, his figure seemed larger than life. He wore an oil-stained factory uniform, a wrench tucked into his belt, and his strides exuded rugged confidence. It was my father, Mr. Carter. Hearing that I was in trouble, he had rushed over with a few apprentices to back me up. My tears flowed instantly. The memories of my previous life felt so distant now. It had been over 30 years since I last saw my dad. Mr. Carter. Overwhelmed with emotion, I sobbed uncontrollably and threw myself into his arms. Dad, clearly shaken, said, "Who dared to wrong my daughter like this?" The apprentices behind him exchanged shocked glances. "Oh my God, this is terrifying." One of them murmured, "Sarah's actually crying. Who's the bastard responsible? Come out and take your beating. Who's the scumbag that made my sister cry so hard she's calling for her dad?" Another added, "Everyone in the factory knew my dad, Mr. Carter, as a tough, no-nonsense man who never backed down from a fight." The moment he arrived, Jonathan panicked and darted into the inner room, slamming the door shut and locking it from the inside. The force of the door shutting knocked over some bottles on the cabinet, shattering them with a sharp crash. I clung to my dad's arm, crying so hard I could barely speak. My dad turned his piercing gaze toward the two so-called lovebirds inside the room. Jonathan and Emma, still huddled together, trembled as they looked at us like scared pigeons facing a pack of wolves. Who are these people? Sarah, Dad asked. Jonathan, trying to recover his composure, spoke up. Mr. Carter. It's me. Jonathan. Dad furrowed his brow, struggling to recognize him. Jonathan? And who's this girl? Emma chimed in. I'm Emma White. Oh, Emma White. Dad said sarcastically. The sickly girl from the White family. Huh, you seem to handle a beating pretty well. Jonathan, encouraged by Dad's relatively calm tone, stood up straighter and said, Mr. Carter, your daughter has truly disappointed me. Even if she wouldn't agree to my proposal, that doesn't give her the right to attack me and the innocent Miss White. Ha! Dad scoffed, his fists clenching. The factory manager, workshop supervisor, and a few bystanders listened intently as Jonathan shamelessly twisted the story. But trying to manipulate the truth in front of my dad was a mistake. Just as Dad narrowed his eyes and raised his massive, callous fists, a powerful, furious voice rang out from outside. Innocent? Who said he's innocent? My mother, Mrs. Carter, stormed in, one side of her hair styled in freshly set curls and the other still in rollers. Her hands were on her hips, and her glare could cut through steel. With a commanding step forward, she announced her presence. Mom! I stumbled forward and hugged her tightly, tears streaming down my face. Mom's expression softened for a moment before she snapped. Stop crying. He's not worth the tears. He's nothing more than a two-faced dog of a man. We're better off without him. Behind her, Aunt Linda, a close friend of Mom's, appeared with the matchmaker who had introduced Jonathan and me. The matchmaker, her hair also half curled, seemed to have rushed straight from the salon. Emma White, Aunt Linda called out sharply. Let me ask you this. Did you know that Jonathan was seeing Sarah through a matchmaking arrangement? All eyes turned to Emma, under the weight of everyone's stares. She muttered a barely audible yes. Aunt Linda didn't hold back. You knew? Then you deliberately stole another woman's man, didn't you? Emma, flustered and teary-eyed, tried to cry again. Aunt Linda cut her off. Save it. How about stepping out of his arms before you start crying? Huh. Only then did Jonathan and Emma realize they were still clinging to each other. Awkwardly, they separated, their faces pale with embarrassment. Mrs. Carter, it's not what you think. Jonathan stammered. Emma and I. Mom didn't even spare him a proper glance. Tisk. Look at you. All beaten up and pathetic. Serves you right, she said, her disdain evident. Jonathan, you're out here hugging Emma White in broad daylight, in front of everyone, and you still don't have the guts to own up to it? What kind of man are you? Jonathan faltered, his confidence wavering. Emma, standing behind him, timidly tugged at his sleeve. When he turned to look at her, the pitiful expression on her face reignited his protective instincts. We just confirmed our feelings for each other, Jonathan said weakly, referring to himself and Emma White. Oh, so you're admitting it now? Straight from your own mouth, Mom said with a sarcastic laugh as she calmly pulled up a chair and sat down. On the way here, I heard from someone that you, Jonathan, declared in front of the factory manager, the workshop supervisor, and several new employees that you are someone Sarah can never have. Well, let me tell you, my daughter doesn't need to waste her time on someone like you, Mom added, glaring at him. But you and Sarah have been acquainted for a few months now. Funny how you didn't confirm your feelings earlier. Only after Sarah caught you and Emma White red-handed did you suddenly decide to come clean. Aunt Linda clicked her tongue in disdain. Doesn't this sound like one of those philandering men from folk tales? Juggling women and pretending to be innocent. Mom nodded in agreement. Everyone can see what's happening here. Today you like one woman. Tomorrow it's another. And the day after, you're sacrificing yourself for someone else. What is this? Some kind of matchmaking contest? Tell me, does a man like this deserve a beating or not? As Mom's words hung in the air, Jonathan's face turned green with shame. I'm not like that, Jonathan protested. Yes, I went on a date with Sarah, but my heart belongs to Emma White. Mom seized on his words immediately, slapping the table and raising her voice. Hear that? Everyone. First, it was Sarah, and now it's Emma. Tell me, Jonathan, aren't you just playing with people's feelings? I wasn't playing with anyone. Jonathan exclaimed defensively. I made it clear to Sarah that we weren't going to work out. Of course. It's not going to work out now that you've been caught. Mom retorted. But you wanted to marry my daughter, didn't you? And then you wanted her to give up her chance at the outstanding worker title so Emma White could take it. Everyone heard you say that. Right. Jonathan could only nod. So, was it Emma who begged you to make that sacrifice? Mom asked, her sharp gaze turning to Emma. Emma instinctively shook her head, trembling under the scrutiny. Then it must have been your brilliant idea, Jonathan. Mom said with biting sarcasm. What's next? Marrying you would make someone a queen or a concubine. Is being your wife supposed to be some kind of grand honor? She slapped the table again, making everyone in the room, guilty or not, flinch. Jonathan, your behavior today has been eye-opening for our family. Let me tell you something. I, Linda Carter, have friends everywhere. Friends in the disciplinary committee. Friends in the Women's Federation. Even old friends in the factory's general affairs office. And let's not forget my husband. You know how respected Mr. Carter is in this factory. He doesn't need to rally a crowd. Even a few apprentices are enough to handle the likes of you. She leaned forward, her voice icy. From now on, we go our separate ways. But if I hear even a whisper about Sarah from your mouth, take a guess at what my family will do. Jonathan pressed his lips tightly together, not daring to say another word. Finally, Mom turned to Emma and said coldly, and you, Emma White, should know better. Picking up someone else's leftovers is one thing, but don't go snatching up something someone else still wants. Even a stray cat will scratch you for that. As if on cue, the family cat, Mittens, let out a loud meow. Startling Emma, she immediately shrank behind Jonathan, trembling in both fear and embarrassment. However, she still couldn't resist sneaking a smug, defiant glance in my direction. Jonathan gently comforted her, murmuring, "Don't worry. You still have me." Standing there, watching their nauseating display, I couldn't help but feel utterly disgusted. When I finally returned home, the day's events continued to weigh heavily on my mind. I gazed around the workers' dormitory where I had lived as a young woman, lost in thought for a long time. It wasn't until dinner time, as I listened to my parents discussing things at the table, that I finally snapped back to reality. Fengxia, are we just going to let Jonathan and Emma White off the hook like that? Dad asked, his tone tinged with frustration. What else can we do? Mom replied, do you really want Sarah to lose her chance at the outstanding worker title? Everyone saw her hit them this time. Jonathan is a college graduate, and Emma is adored by so many people in the factory. If they decide not to pursue the matter, we should send some gifts and pay our respects to make sure Sarah's qualifications are reinstated. Dad, Mom, please don't. I interjected. I don't want to compete for the title anymore. Dad looked at me, his sharp gaze noticing something was off. You've always been strong-willed, he said. I've got a few young guys working under me. They're not college graduates, but they're decent. I can introduce you to one of them tomorrow. Mom snorted. Sarah crying over a man? No way. It must be about losing the outstanding worker title. I licked my lips nervously before asking, Mom, if I'd married Jonathan without knowing about Emma, only to discover later that she was in his heart. But he wouldn't admit it, and I couldn't get a divorce. If I ended up wasting my entire life on him, would that make me pathetic? Mom shrugged. Not a chance. At the very least, you do what you did today. Give those two a good beating. Maybe even strip them down and toss them into the courtyard. That was something I had actually done in my past life, though I never went as far as stripping them. Dad muttered, You've got your mom and me. We'd help you teach those two scumbags a lesson. But the truth haunted me. The year I gave birth to my son, I discovered that the family savings were gone, and the pantry was nearly empty. When I stepped out of the dormitory to buy groceries, I saw Jonathan carrying half a bag of rice and flour into Emma's house. Naturally, I stormed over and caused a massive scene. It was during that chaos that my parents, rushing back from visiting relatives, got into a car accident. Tears welled up as I choked out, Dad, Mom, I'm so sorry. My voice broke into sobs. Don't cry, sweetheart, Dad said firmly. There's nothing for you to apologize for. If you feel embarrassed, That's all the more reason to hold your head high. Go to work as usual. We won't let you endure this humiliation in vain. Looking at my parents through tear-filled eyes, I slowly came to a realization. These were my parents, the people who loved me the most in the world. How could they ever hold a grudge against me? But back in my previous life, when the terrible news arrived, Jonathan had repeatedly blamed me. It's all because of your paranoia, he'd yelled. Not only did you ruin my reputation and career, but you also caused the deaths of your own parents. How many times do I have to tell you? I only took care of Emma because her father helped me once. Jonathan and I were always innocent, he had insisted. That day, it wasn't just Emma at the house. Her mother was there too. How could you have such a disgusting mindset to think otherwise? Your parents' deaths were entirely because of your malice and narrow-mindedness. For years afterward, Jonathan weaponized this tragedy in our arguments, accusing me of being the one responsible for my parents' deaths. He made me relive my guilt and regret repeatedly, torturing me emotionally. But the truth was clear. If it hadn't been for his ambiguous relationship with Emma, none of this would have happened. Did you hear? Someone whispered. Jonathan ended up in the hospital last night. His dorm mate had to rush him there. What happened to Emma? She's fine. Jonathan claims it was appendicitis. Not because of Sarah's punches. At least he's trying to act like a man about it. A man? Please. He's always been the type to eat from one bowl while eyeing the next. But what can you expect? He's the factory manager's golden boy. The college graduate who's already got half the women in the factory swooning over him. Sarah doesn't stand a chance next to him. The next morning, I went to work. Just as I expected. The workshop was buzzing with gossip. As soon as I appeared, the chatter abruptly stopped. Oh, the demon lady's here. Someone muttered. It was Towing, the same young woman who had jeered at me yesterday while watching the drama unfold from outside the window. I hadn't seen her in over 30 years. In my previous life, we'd briefly been co-workers. We hadn't interacted much. But for some reason, she always had a problem with me, nitpicking everything I did. At the time, I had been lost in the bliss of my newlywed life, proud to have married Jonathan, one of the few college graduates in the factory. He was gentle, handsome, and had a bright future ahead of him. Compared to the other young men in the factory, Jonathan was practically a rare gem. Back then, I paid little attention to Tao Ying's snide remarks, dismissing her as insignificant. But this time, Tao Ying had crossed my path at the wrong moment. I wasn't about to hold back. You think you're so tough? Is that why you're always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong? I snapped. Tao Ying flinched but didn't back down, her sharp tongue still going. You're nothing but a loud-mouthed bully. No wonder a college graduate like Jonathan doesn't want you. I didn't hesitate. I ripped off my work gloves and flung them straight at her face. You're living without shame. Do you think that'll win you any prizes? I sneered. If you're so desperate for the man I've already discarded, go for it. Why not throw yourself at him? Yesterday, Jonathan had Emma in his arms. Why didn't you join in? What's stopping you? Afraid you'll get turned down. Tao Ying turned pale, her lips trembling as she tried to think of a response. If you don't have the guts, then why don't you line up behind Jonathan's other admirers? Who knows? Your turn might come someday. But with your face, you'd better prepare to play second fiddle. That was enough to make Tao Ying burst into tears and run off. I could only assume she was moved to tears by my cutting words of wisdom. In my past life, I had a bad temper. In this one, it was even sharper. I wasn't going to tolerate anyone dragging me down again, especially not after everything I'd endured in my previous life, including the agony of breast cancer. Over the next few days, the gossip quieted down. Hardly anyone dared to talk behind my back anymore. However, Tao Ying was clearly unwilling to admit defeat. She redirected her attention to pursuing Jonathan, launching a full-fledged campaign to win his favor. One day, she brought him flowers at the hospital. The next, she made him homemade soup, playing the role of a devoted wife-in-waiting. Her friends tried to dissuade her, saying, Tao Ying, enough is enough. But Tao Ying refused to listen. Jonathan is the most handsome and educated man in the factory, she argued. Even the factory manager praises his writing. The other men here? They're either clueless or unbearable. None of them can compare to him. Jonathan had already stolen Emma White for himself. Did Towing honestly think she could outdo Emma, the factory's infamous sickly beauty? Apparently. Even her friend had had enough of her antics and stopped getting involved. For the next few days, Towing kept showing up at the hospital, bringing Jonathan gifts, meals, and flowers. Jonathan, true to his nature, accepted everything without outright rejecting or encouraging her, leaving Towing convinced she still had a chance. During this time, Emma White remained uncharacteristically quiet. No tears. No drama. Meanwhile, Jonathan's written apology had already been circulated around the factory. The factory leaders, recognizing the rarity and value of college-educated employees, decided to let bygones be bygones. They noted Jonathan's supposed maturity. He hadn't filed any formal complaints about me despite being hospitalized. They were eager to sweep everything under the rug, but there was no way I was letting them off the hook so easily. By September, the northern weather was turning chilly. Towing arrived at work wearing a fitted dress in a pale yellow that accentuated her delicate features. She strolled over to Jonathan, who handed her a poetry collection. "This poem," he said, "perfectly expresses the depth of my love for you." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. The poet's original words weren't about love at all. It was a declaration of love for the land. In my past life, Jonathan had also recited poetry to me during our happier moments. But back then, it was all about rivers and wild geese, with me playing the role of his ever-dutiful caretaker. Even in our best days, I was little more than a glorified housekeeper in his eyes. Towing noticed my amusement. "What's so funny?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I'm laughing at how some people don't even realize how foolish they are," I replied. Towing, undeterred, straightened her posture like a fighter ready to attack. "Oh, really? What did you and Jonathan ever talk about? Poetry? Literature? Or just the price of duck eggs at the market?" Feigning a serious tone, I replied, "Oh, we discussed everything. Marxist theory, political policy, industrial strategies, the path from the Industrial Revolution to modern reforms, poetry, philosophy, you name it." With each subject I listed, Tao Ying's expression darkened further. By the end, she was practically fuming. "Do you even know who Ai Ching is? Or what he wrote about?" I added, twisting the knife. "You're out here talking about love and romance, but you don't even know the basics of literature." Towing finally snapped. "What makes you so special? You've only got an elementary school education. Jonathan would never pick you over me." I smirked. "Jonathan's been in the hospital for how long now? Has he even mentioned your name once? All this time you've been parading around in front of him, throwing yourself at him. Has it worked? Has he confessed his undying love for you yet?" I leaned closer. "At least with Emma, Jonathan could fake some affection in front of me. But you? You're nothing. You're just standing here, shouting about your so-called love. Tell me, are you the land he loves so deeply? Or is it something else entirely?" Towing was trembling with anger, her fists clenched. Suddenly, she slapped herself twice, hard, across her pale cheeks. Raising her reddened face, she declared, "I'll tell Jonathan you hit me out of jealousy. He'll never forgive you. He loves me, and he belongs with me." In my previous life, I'd never noticed how unhinged Towing could be. Now, I was almost eager to see how far she'd go. "Then you'd better hurry up and put on your act," I said dryly. "But don't forget, you're still no match for Emma White." Towing shot me a venomous glare before storming off. From a short distance away, Emma White, who had been silently crying and biting her lip, suddenly turned and hurried toward the hospital. Two rivals in love heading for the same man. I couldn't have been more amused. I glanced at the clock, then rushed to the communication office to make a few phone calls. Later that night, word spread like wildfire. Jonathan's tangled love life had finally backfired. In the hospital, Towing had collided with him in a dramatic scene, breaking two of his ribs. The hospital erupted into chaos. Towing and Emma White ended up pulling each other's hair while Jonathan groaned in pain. Meanwhile, two other women, unrelated but equally emotional, stood off to the side crying. Adding to the commotion, two women were shouting, and another tried to take advantage of the chaos to whisk Jonathan away. Meanwhile, The remaining women in the room hurriedly pulled him back and demanded he explain everything. Towing, with scratches on her face from Emma White's nails, realized Jonathan wasn't helping her at all, and fled in embarrassment. The room was packed with other women who, like her, had hoped to catch Jonathan's attention. Fueled by frustration and rage, one of them rammed into Jonathan like a bull. Headfirst, Jonathan was sent flying out the door, landing flat on the ground and breaking 2 ribs in the process. Dad's apprentice, Sam, told the story with wild enthusiasm, even holding up 2 fingers for emphasis. At the time, we were sitting at a street food stall with a few of Dad's younger apprentices, enjoying skewers and cheap liquor. I downed a shot of white wine in one go, relishing the news and feeling quite satisfied. When Jonathan got knocked out the door, he took someone down with him. Sam added, grinning. Guess who it was? Sarah. I didn't reply, but the young men around us were impatient. Don't leave us hanging. Just tell us already. Sam leaned in conspiratorially. It was a higher up from the government. Someone visiting undercover to inspect the area. It's like one of those secret royal visits. You know? Turns out he wasn't feeling well, and decided to go to the hospital for a low-key checkup. Then bam! Jonathan crashes into him and sends him to the ground. The guy ended up with a fractured bone. One of the boys interjected, "You've got to be kidding. That's too much of a coincidence." Sam scoffed. Coincidence? More like karma. Jonathan brought it on himself. Sam continued, "While Jonathan's been in the hospital, countless young women have been visiting him, trying to win him over. He accepts their gifts, their books, their attention, all of it. He calls it connecting through literature. My sister, who's a nurse, says there's basically a steady stream of visitors. Every 2 hours, a new one shows up, talks with him for an hour, and then leaves, just in time for the next one to arrive. It's like clockwork, to avoid them bumping into each other. But then, one day, something went wrong. Somehow, all the women showed up at the same time. Towing was practically throwing herself into Jonathan's arms when Emma White walked in. The 2 of them immediately started fighting, pulling each other's hair. If that isn't karma, I don't know what is." One of the apprentices chimed in, clearly enjoying the story. Jonathan's finally paying for it. I stayed quiet, sipping my drink as the scene played out in my mind. Inside, I was thrilled. This chaotic gathering of Jonathan's admirers was precisely what I had planned. Having grown up in the factory, I knew nearly everyone. It wasn't hard to figure out who had been visiting Jonathan. As for the undercover official's visit, I remembered reading about it in a newspaper during my previous life. And Tao-Ying? She was like a rogue missile, perfectly crashing into the chaos I'd orchestrated. Back in the 1980s, Jonathan's status as a college graduate made him a magnet for attention, attracting countless women eager to win him over. Even after Jonathan and I started dating, there were still plenty of admirers fluttering around him like moths to a flame. But I wasn't one to tolerate that kind of nonsense. My temper, combined with my family's firm stance, meant that any attempts to flirt with Jonathan ended abruptly. Once, I caught a small gift left on his office desk by a young admirer. Furious, I made a scene that left a lasting impression. Jonathan finally learned to refuse such advances, and things settled down. But this life was entirely different. Emma White, with her frail and delicate demeanor, specialized in looking pitiful with teary eyes and trembling hands, like a wind-blown willow clinging to survival. At work, she was perpetually incompetent, constantly procrastinating and pushing her responsibilities onto others. Her act worked on plenty of people, but I wasn't fooled. Emma White frequently used her health as an excuse to take time off, constantly dragging her work behind schedule. After Jonathan and I had our fallout, Emma's reputation for stealing men spread through the factory like wildfire. Someone like her, daring to covet the outstanding worker title when she couldn't achieve it through legitimate means. She shamelessly sought to benefit from men instead. This made her even more despised by the factory workers. As for Jonathan, the college graduate halo still lingered around him, but most people couldn't help but wonder, what made Emma White think she was worthy of being with someone like Jonathan? The 3 of us became the subject of endless gossip, especially after the hospital drama. Following the fight in the hospital room, Emma shut herself in her house and went on a hunger strike. Her mother stood outside her bedroom door with a bowl of rice, pleading with her for 2 days straight. It was yet another spectacle, ensuring everyone knew how pitiful she was. The next time I ran into Taoying, she was wearing a dingy gray factory uniform and carrying her belongings from the dorm. Beside her was her father, hiding his face completely under a straw hat. Taoying's neck was tilted awkwardly, like she'd slept wrong, and her rolled-back eyes were just as lopsided. "I just don't get it," she muttered. "Why does Jonathan like Emma White, but not me? And why you? Of all people. Don't drag me into your mess with those two scumbags," I said dismissively. "Didn't you see what happened at the hospital? Between our factory girls, the outsiders, and you and Emma White, there were 8 women in total, all fighting over Jonathan. That's enough to set up 2 full mahjong tables. And yet here you are, still obsessing about your rank in Jonathan's imaginary harem." Taoying's neck hurt as she tried to argue, pressing her hand against it to ease the pain. "I know his character isn't great, but his qualifications are. Don't act like you're above caring. Sarah, it's easy for you to say. Your dad works in the key workshops, and your mom's in the office. If my family background were as good as yours, I could have been the one dating a college graduate." Taoying's words spilled out thoughtlessly, even dragging her own father down in the process. "Why do you think I'm the obstacle between you and Jonathan?" I asked, my tone sharp. "Don't play dumb. Jonathan proposed to you, didn't he? Whatever his reasons, you're the only woman he's ever said he wanted to marry. Emma White doesn't mean anything. If he really cared about her, he wouldn't keep stringing her along without marrying her. Jonathan's just playing with her. That's all. The outstanding worker title? That was just a favor to keep her quiet. It was never about love." Her explanation hit me like a bolt of clarity. Why hadn't I thought of it that way before? But that didn't mean I was about to tolerate Taoying's repeated provocations. Seeing that she wanted to continue, I switched to mockery. "You don't actually like Jonathan, do you? You just want to marry him for a better life and to satisfy your vanity. The only reason you have a problem with me is because I nearly got the one thing you've been dreaming of. Now that I've given it up, you're desperate to have it, just to prove you can be better than someone else. You and Emma White have been at each other's throats for so long. But take a look around. You're not the only one with that mindset. Plenty of other girls are just like you." Taoying's face turned red with anger, but she couldn't refute my words. The competition wasn't just between her and Emma. It was a crowded field, and none of them stood out. "You want to stand out," I said to Taoying. "But in Jonathan's heart, you don't even matter. Taoying, there's more than one man in this world, and marriage isn't the only way to change your circumstances. How long are you going to keep fighting yourself like this? Haven't you learned your lesson yet? Being reassigned to a local factory?" I glanced at her silent, downcast expression and decided she wasn't worth arguing with anymore. I walked away, leaving her to stew in her frustration. Taoying, unable to vent her anger elsewhere, kicked a lamppost on the side of the road in a fit of rage. "Taoying," her father called after her. "It's getting dark. Let's head home before the buses stop running." Noticing her lingering defiance, he added, "I know you look down on me because I shovel coal in the cafeteria. You have high hopes and want to marry a college graduate to prove yourself. But that man doesn't care about you. Look at all those girls who visited him in the hospital. Every one of them brought books as gifts. That white girl, her house is filled with books. Sarah almost married him, and even she didn't stand a chance. So why are you throwing yourself at him for nothing?" Taoying crouched down, finally letting out a muffled sob. "In my past life, Jonathan wanted me as the dependable wife to manage his household, while he sought emotional comfort and artistic inspiration from Emma White's gentle, cultured demeanor. She provided him with a steady source of validation and admiration. He built a family with me, but when he had free time, he was always at Emma's house. The worst fight we had was when I confronted him about it. But Jonathan still refused to divorce me. Emma even went so far as to forge a virginity test document and post it on the factory bulletin board to prove her purity and her platonic relationship with Jonathan. The factory workers ate it up. Their illicit affair was transformed into a noble, platonic love, celebrated as a modern-day tale of philosophical connection and spiritual purity. Meanwhile, I was painted as the villain, a malicious, narrow-minded wife. Jonathan, on the other hand, was lauded as a magnanimous gentleman, forgiving me for my inability to understand their soulful bond. Back then, divorce wasn't like it is now. It was a process filled with humiliation, requiring approval from the workplace, input from colleagues, and judgment from relatives, neighbors, and even community committees. Everyone felt entitled to an opinion. At times, I even dreamed of the stray dogs in front of my house barking, telling me not to divorce. Real or imagined, it all felt suffocating. Ultimately, I didn't get the divorce. The weight of public opinion, the death of my parents, and the responsibility of raising my son held me back. My infamous reputation as a shrew barred me from promotions at work, while Jonathan's image as a kind and understanding man paved his way to success. Even my neighbors, like Aunt Linda, would tell me, if the love is gone, hold on to the money, keep him on a short leash, let him come and go as he pleases, but never let Emma White take your place. Over time, even the sweetest things can turn sour. I listened. Jonathan did start earning more money, and I treated him as nothing more than a breadwinner. We lived separately, enduring a joyless marriage for decades. But I wasn't happy. I barely lived into my 50s before succumbing to breast cancer, a lifetime of resentment and repression finally taking its toll. In this life, I cut ties with Jonathan the moment I saw through him. I made his affair with Emma White public, exposing them both. If their love was truly so deep and profound, why did it come with so much drama and resentment? Jonathan never truly loved anyone. He only cared about who could benefit him the most at any given time, placing them in the role that suited him best. And for such a selfish man, with his hollow promises and false affections, I spent an entire lifetime carrying a terrible reputation. Not anymore. If he wanted to ruin me, I wasn't going to let him succeed this time. If Jonathan wanted to play games, then I wasn't going to hold back. I'd expose him even further. After the National Day holiday, the factory announced the winners of the Outstanding Worker Awards. Each department had its own recipients. Among those stepping onto the stage to accept their awards, I finally saw someone I'd been eager to meet, Jonathan's older sister, Lisa Lou. In my past life, Lisa had been a strong and capable woman. She was Jonathan's elder sister and had always been a commanding presence in the family. This life was no different. She had a sharp, refined beauty, with an air of confidence and elegance that set her apart from everyone else. Even in the factory's plain, oversized uniform, she carried herself with a natural, intellectual grace. In this life, Lisa had been working on a local transport line and only transferred to the main factory after earning the Outstanding Worker title. After the awards ceremony, the factory held a celebratory banquet. I wanted to approach Lisa and introduce myself, but before I could, I overheard her scolding someone in a hushed tone. "Stop crying to me about marrying Jonathan," she said firmly. "If he wanted to marry you, he would have already written to our parents back home. The letter we got recently clearly mentioned a girl named Sarah Chong from a matchmaking introduction. And now, you show up out of nowhere, spouting nonsense to me. What exactly do you expect me to do about it?" I immediately recognized the voice responding to Lisa. It was Emma White, her face pale and brows furrowed. She looked on the verge of tears but hadn't quite broken down yet. "Lisa, please," she pleaded. "Come with me to the hospital. Jonathan's waiting for you." I couldn't help but laugh at Emma's desperation. "If you're saying it like that, Emma, is Jonathan about to die in the hospital?" Emma flinched at my words, and a bead of cold sweat rolled down her forehead. The surrounding chatter died down as everyone turned to look at us. I had always faced my enemies boldly and openly, never one to shy away from a confrontation. Emma, on the other hand, was already buckling under the weight of public scrutiny, shrinking in stature as if the crowd's attention physically weighed her down. Even before we exchanged words, she had already lost her composure. I watched her silently for a moment, and she gritted her teeth as if steeling herself. Finally, she spoke, forcing herself to stand her ground. "Sarah, if it weren't for you, Jonathan wouldn't be in the hospital right now." That moment, I felt a surge of gratitude toward Jonathan's carefully curated image of being kind and forgiving. Wasn't Jonathan hospitalized for appendicitis? I asked innocently. Why is he still in the hospital? Are you saying it wasn't appendicitis but because you and Towing were fighting and accidentally broke his ribs while he was trying to intervene? Oh, poor Jonathan. But if that's the case, isn't his misfortune your fault? What does it have to do with me? A wave of laughter and mocking remarks rippled through the crowd. Emma White, of all people, dares to say that. She managed to steal Jonathan from Sarah. But clearly, she can't handle him. And now she's blaming Sarah for her own incompetence? How shameless. Emma's head drooped lower and lower under the weight of the ridicule. A familiar-looking coworker patted her on the shoulder. But Emma only clutched her face and fled the banquet in tears. The jeers didn't stop even after she was gone. Lisa looked puzzled by the entire exchange. But I calmly extended my hand toward her and introduced myself. Hi, Lisa. I'm Sarah Chung. Lisa furrowed her brows slightly but still smiled politely as she shook my hand. Miss Chung, how do you know me? How could I not know you? I replied with a smile. You were on stage receiving an award earlier, and the MC announced your name. It reminded me of an article I read somewhere that you wrote. Lisa looked surprised. You've read my articles? None of them have ever been published. I only sent them to my brother. Speaking in an admiring tone, I described an article I had recently read, my voice carrying just enough to attract the attention of a few leaders nearby, including the factory manager, who was particularly fond of Jonathan's writing. When Lisa heard that I had genuinely read her work, she began sharing her thoughts on the creative process, sources of inspiration, and how she structured her writing. As she spoke, the factory manager's expression shifted from curiosity to suspicion, then to delight, and finally to a knowing look. I had a hunch that Lisa kept drafts of her work in her bag, so I casually brought it up. She hesitated for a moment before pulling out a few pieces, humbly saying, "They're not very good. I'd love to hear everyone's feedback." The drafts were passed around, eventually landing in the hands of the factory manager. Among them was a piece that I immediately recognized. Jonathan had previously claimed it as his own. After reading it, the factory manager chuckled and praised it 3 times. That very evening, a notice was sent to transfer Lisa from her transportation line to the general office. In my previous life, my education level wasn't high, but I had married Jonathan, the so-called talented scholar of the factory. After our wedding, he only expected me to manage the household and didn't bother engaging with me much intellectually. Determined not to be left behind, I tried teaching myself by reading his books and articles, but my progress was slow and frustrating. The first time I met Lisa was during our first Chinese New Year as a married couple. Jonathan and I had gone back to his hometown, and Lisa was working on a local transportation line at the time. She noticed me reading newspapers and practicing my writing. Unlike Jonathan, she didn't mock or belittle me. Instead, she offered to help me improve. After returning to the factory, I often read Jonathan's articles when he wasn't around. Over time, I noticed something strange. Jonathan always had 2 copies of each article, one stored neatly in a box and the other in his desk drawer. The handwriting on the box copies was elegant and meticulous, clearly Lisa's. Meanwhile, the drawer copies bore Jonathan's handwriting. It became apparent to me that Lisa was the real writer behind the articles that the factory manager admired so much. Jonathan had simply copied her work and claimed it as his own. When I confronted him about it, Jonathan flew into a rage. He burned all the boxed articles and locked the desk drawer. Confused and hurt, I chose not to press further for the sake of our marriage. Years later, when I brought it up again, Jonathan dismissed me, saying, "You only have an elementary school education. There's no way you understood those drafts. You must have been mistaken." Left with no way to prove myself, I dropped the matter. In my previous life, Lisa had also earned the Outstanding Worker title but, for reasons unknown, never made it to the main factory. This time, however, with Jonathan hospitalized after our fight, and his ribs broken thanks to Towing, Lisa successfully transferred to the general office. I could easily guess the reason behind this turn of events. Word of Lisa's arrival at the factory sent Jonathan into a panic. Still confined to his hospital bed, he was beside himself with anxiety. He was so desperate that he sent Emma White to try and bring Lisa from the celebratory banquet to the hospital. But Emma failed miserably. Jonathan, his face pale with frustration, scolded her. How can you not even manage something as simple as this? Emma, her eyes red with anger, retorted. How can you blame me? Wasn't it your letter to your family saying your match was a girl named Sarah Chung that caused all this trouble? Because of you, I've become the laughingstock of the factory. Everywhere I go, people are pointing fingers and whispering behind my back. And now you expect me to clean up your mess. I still ended up going. However, Lisa, for some reason, completely ignored me. Perhaps someone had said something to her. Meanwhile, Jonathan was growing increasingly frustrated with Emma White's tears but continued to pacify her with empty words. Why don't you go find my sister? He suggested. Isn't it all for the sake of our marriage? I wanted her to have a good impression of you before bringing you home to meet my parents for New Year's. Besides, I'm in the hospital. Shouldn't my sister have come to visit me right away? Isn't that more important than attending some celebratory banquet? Hearing this, Emma felt a bit better. However, the memory of Lisa's cold attitude earlier stung, and she couldn't resist making something up. Your sister seems to be highly regarded by the leadership, she said casually. I told her about your hospitalization, but as soon as Sarah mentioned that the manager wanted to meet her, she turned and left without a second thought. Jonathan frowned. Who did you say? Sarah, Emma repeated hesitantly, observing his reaction. She wouldn't have said anything bad about me in front of your sister, would she? Do you think Lisa might be upset with me now? Jonathan's mind drifted elsewhere. He couldn't help but wonder why Sarah had shown up at the banquet. After all, she no longer had the qualifications for the outstanding worker title. Was it her family's influence? Her mother's extensive connections? And how did she just happen to meet his sister? Could it be that Sarah still had feelings for him? Emma's voice interrupted his thoughts. Do you think your sister doesn't like me? She asked, her tone a mix of coyness and jealousy. Her slightly pouty expression added a charm that could occasionally be captivating, but quickly became tiresome when overdone. Jonathan's thoughts flickered back to Sarah. Despite her blunt and fiery personality, there was a refreshing straightforwardness to her. She wasn't the most beautiful woman, but her bold features had a certain charm, and her expressions were often animated and amusing. He had once assumed that her lack of education would make her easy to control, but her temper had proven otherwise. When angered, she didn't hesitate to throw punches, leaving no room for mercy. Jonathan shook his head with a smile, returning his attention to Emma. Why would Lisa dislike you? Emma, you're beautiful, educated, and thoughtful. Of course, she'll like you. Just then, Nurse Wu entered the room on her rounds. Visiting hours are over, she said, glancing at Emma. Why are you still here? Emma hesitated. Can't I stay? The nurse smirked. If you're his wife or an immediate family member, sure, you can stay and take care of him. But do you have any official status here? What do you think this hospital is? A hotel? If you don't leave, I'll have to call security. Emma cast a longing glance at Jonathan before reluctantly leaving. His response, however, was perfunctory, his smile barely reaching his eyes. Later, Lisa finally came to visit Jonathan at the hospital. His eyes lit up with anticipation, but there was no warmth in her gaze. Lisa, why did it take you so long to get here? He asked, a mix of reproach and relief in his voice. Lisa gave him a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Are you upset that I came late? Or are you upset that I came at all? How could I be upset? Jonathan replied quickly. You're my sister. Of course. I'm happy to see you. Lisa remained indifferent, her tone steady as she replied. Good. Because I'd hate to think my visit caused you any trouble. Then take care and recover well. I'll head back now, Lisa said, preparing to leave. Are you going back to the local transport line or to the general office? Jonathan asked, clearly fishing for information. Lisa didn't bother with riddles. Of course. I'm going back to the general office, she replied. Jonathan's tone grew desperate. Lisa, we're family. If I succeed, doesn't that benefit you too? Lisa let out a cold laugh. You went to college, and I went to college. Do you think those experiences were the same? Back then, I was also accepted to university, but our family insisted on sending you. You spent 4 years getting the best education in Beijing. And as soon as you graduated, you landed a job in the main factory. Meanwhile, I was stuck on the transport line, doing the same dirty, grueling work as everyone else. 4 years later, I finally made it to the city to accept an award, only to find out you'd written home, asking Mom and Dad to find a way to hold me back. First, I didn't understand why you didn't want to see me succeed. Then I saw the factory's internal publication, and everything became clear. My articles were published under your name. Jonathan cut her off. Panicked. Lisa, you can't expose me. I'm the only college graduate in the family. If you ruin my future, Mom and Dad will hate you for the rest of their lives. Lisa stared at him for a long moment, her gaze filled with disappointment. Finally, she held out her hands, showing the calluses and scars from years of hard labor. These hands were once meant for writing. Now, maybe they can hold a pen again. With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she said, "Do you really think you still have a future? You've been caught up in 2 major scandals over your relationships. Do you think no one's reported you? You've been in this hospital for so long. How many of your former coworkers have come to visit? You've crossed the wrong people from the very beginning." Lisa left, leaving Jonathan pale-faced and silent. I later ran into Lisa again in the factory cafeteria. I waved to her from a distance, and she responded with a polite nod and a courteous smile. Lisa had been working at the general office for a month now, and had undoubtedly heard all the rumors. She was too smart not to figure things out. At the awards banquet, I had intentionally brought up her drafts to reveal Jonathan's plagiarism in front of the factory manager. Regardless of how things unfolded, Lisa still saw Jonathan as her brother. I had used that bond to my advantage, and while I felt a twinge of guilt, I was also pleased. I had changed her trajectory. She could now stay in the city and wouldn't have to return to the countryside to endure an unfortunate marriage. On my way home, carrying a box of gifts, I ran into Jonathan. He looked pale and weak, clearly not fully recovered from his injuries. "Leaving the hospital so soon?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't they say it takes at least 100 days to heal from broken bones?" Jonathan gave me a pitiful look. "Sarah, I owe you an apology." I smiled sweetly. "Oh, you realize you were wrong? Do you want me to hit you again?" Jonathan flinched but pressed on. "Sarah, I know you're angry because I proposed to you with the ulterior motive of having you give up the outstanding worker title to Emma White. But I regret it. Emma is shallow and overly dramatic. She relies on me for everything and could never be as strong and independent as you are." I raised an eyebrow, amused. "Weren't you the one who criticized me for being too simple and rough around the edges?" "That's just your honest and straightforward nature," he said quickly. "I used to think your education level was too low. But even with only an elementary school diploma, you were nominated for Outstanding Worker because of your undeniable capabilities. You're not conventionally beautiful, but your composure and decisiveness give you a unique charm." I laughed. "Wow, Jonathan, it seems like only when you're cornered do you start appreciating all my good qualities. In my previous life, after over 30 years of marriage to this man, he never saw me for who I truly was. Jonathan never had a kind word to say about me, not even a fabricated one. So I, with all the patience I could muster, responded, 'What a load of crap.' As I turned to leave, Jonathan hurried to stop me, desperation in his voice. "Sarah, please forgive me. I really know I was wrong." I turned around and punched him square in the jaw. Jonathan stumbled back, clutching his face, and landed on the ground with a thud. "You know you were wrong?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me list them for you. You entertained every woman who pursued you, playing the role of some time management genius, making each of them believe she was your one and only. Wasn't that your first mistake? Then, you tried to insult Emma White while flattering me, thinking I'd fall for your tricks. You set the two of us, who had no quarrel to begin with, against each other, judging us by your twisted standards. Wasn't that your second mistake? You came to the factory with leadership's high expectations, yet instead of working hard, you focused on crafting a fake image of a brilliant scholar. Behind their backs, you did countless shameful things that disgraced that title. Wasn't that your third mistake? And now, after all your wrongdoings, you come apologizing to me, assuming I'm too stupid to see you for the hypocrite you are." Am I wrong? The more I spoke, the angrier I became. Without thinking, I opened the lunchbox I was carrying and dumped its contents on Jonathan's head. Here's your soul food, I said, brushing off my hands. Since you just got out of the hospital, I won't beat you anymore. But mistakes have consequences. Accept whatever punishment the factory gives you and stay out of my sight. Jonathan sat there, covered in sauce and looking utterly pathetic. He tried wiping his face, but the more he wiped, the worse it got. The onlookers shook their heads, some whispering, others openly pointing and laughing. Sam popped his head out from the crowd, grinning. Jonathan, you've got some nerve coming to bother Sarah again. I quickly pulled Sam aside. Let's go. Sam, no need to waste energy here. Today's a good day. Let's go grab a meal at a nice restaurant. Sounds great, Sarah, Sam replied cheerfully. Meanwhile, Jonathan wasn't about to give up. Realizing he couldn't win me over, he shifted tactics, deciding to appeal to my mother, Fengxia, instead. He showed up at her office carrying an assortment of gifts, including honey, royal jelly, and herbal tonics. Win her over with kindness, he must have thought. But Fengxia didn't even glance at him. Eat someone's food, and you'll owe them. Take someone's gift, and you'll owe them even more, she said. But my name isn't White, and I don't owe anyone anything. Jonathan pretended not to understand. Mrs. Chung, I'm here today to apologize sincerely and formally. Fengxia raised a hand to stop him. Do you see that street corner outside? Place your gifts in the middle of the road, then bow 3 times in all 4 directions. Let's see if anyone forgives you. Jonathan forced a polite smile. You're so funny, Mrs. Chung. No, Fengxia shot back. You're the one joking. Just because someone leaves offerings at a temple doesn't mean the gods have forgiven them. Take your gifts back to wherever they came from. I'm not accepting anything. Got it. The next day, Jonathan tried a new approach. He rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a broom and cloth, and started cleaning Fengxia's office as a form of voluntary service. Fengxia wasn't impressed. She sat there cracking sunflower seeds, acting as though she didn't see him. Jonathan gritted his teeth but worked diligently, cleaning from the start of the workday until closing time. As the clock struck 5, Fengxia grabbed her bag and prepared to leave. Jonathan quickly followed her. Mrs. Chung, I sincerely want to apologize to you and your family. Fengxia gave him a sideways glance. Oh, so you're not here to play the role of a selfless volunteer like Lei Feng, but to serve your own agenda? You want to apologize to my entire family. So, we've accepted your apology. Now what? Do you want me to agree to let you and Sarah get back together? Fengxia's words dripped with sarcasm. I've thought about it. You might really be talented, but you have no conscience. Do you think everyone else is a fool? You bring a few gifts, do a day's worth of work, and expect to be praised like a saint? You think you can sweet-talk your way into taking a daughter we raised for over 20 years as if she's some reward. She paused for effect. My daughter, Sarah, isn't from the White family. She's not the kind of girl who cries and begs for a man to marry her. And we didn't raise her to lower herself for anyone. Jonathan froze. He had anticipated Fengxia would explode in anger, giving him the chance to kneel dramatically in public and display his supposed sincerity. But instead, her every word sliced him like a knife, peeling away his carefully constructed facade to reveal the ugly truth beneath. It's been long enough, Fengxia continued. Aren't you curious why Sarah wasn't punished at all for hitting you, while you had to fake an appendicitis attack and hide in the hospital to let things blow over? Jonathan's face turned pale. I don't know. Maybe the doctors. The doctors? Do you think they just sit around doing nothing? Or maybe you underestimated how connections work in this factory. Fengxia cut him off sharply. Jonathan couldn't respond. He stood there, speechless, as Fengxia's words hit him like a hammer. Working on the transport line will be good for you, she said, her tone softening slightly, though the mockery was still evident. It'll toughen your spirit, strengthen your body, and keep your hands busy. Jonathan's defeated expression was almost pitiable. Fengxia gave him a faint smile. What? Did you think you were the only cultured person in the room? If it weren't for those chaotic years, Sarah wouldn't have only an elementary school education. But even so, She's the best daughter in the world. You think she's beneath you. But to me, you're the one who's not good enough for her. Now, go where you're assigned. And don't bother me or my family again. None of us will ever forgive you. Jonathan had always prided himself on being a man of great ability. To be dismissed as nothing by a seemingly unremarkable woman like Fengxia felt like a lifetime wound, a humiliation he would never recover from. When Fengxia finished recounting the story at the dinner table, I laughed so hard I nearly fell off my chair. Fengxia, you're amazing, I said, still catching my breath. She gave a mock shiver, rubbing her arms as if shaking off goosebumps. Come on, don't flatter me. Even your dad can't stop laughing. Who isn't cultured? That college graduate looked completely stunned. Even Fengxia couldn't help but laugh at the end. That boy's brain is like a leaky sieve, she added. He didn't even realize the factory manager's decision had already been made. He still came groveling to me, flattering the wrong person. What was he thinking? Jonathan might have been a college graduate, but he had no real foundation. Back when he was choosing a match, he had so many options. Why did he pick me? It was because both my parents held important positions in the factory, and I seemed like the best prospect for him, now that his fraudulent articles had been discovered by the factory manager. He was desperate to plead with anyone he thought might help him. Coming to my family was clearly his last resort after exhausting all other options. But then a thought struck me. Jonathan had dared to approach me. Did that mean he was no longer concerned about Emma White? If Jonathan were truly reassigned to the transport line in another town, would someone like Emma, who constantly sought shortcuts, follow him there? In my past life, the two of them had caused me so much misery. This time, they had to stick together and face the consequences. There was no way I'd let them separate and escape their shared fate. Sam later returned with news. Jonathan's been telling people he's being transferred, and saying he doesn't want to drag Emma down with him. Sounds like he's trying to cut ties with her indirectly. And what about Emma? I asked. On one hand, Emma promised Jonathan that she would wait for him no matter what. On the other hand, she began accepting gifts from another admirer, Sean Gao, a technician who had quietly been watching over her. Sean's gifts weren't cheap. Things like hero pins and black leather shoes, all highly coveted items at the time. The name Sean Gao stirred a faint memory in my mind. After thinking for a while, I finally remembered. He was that quiet man who always seemed to hover on the edges of social circles. He was the one who had defended Emma at the medical office after the fight, calling her pure and quiet. And the same man who had tried to console her at the awards banquet by patting her shoulder. In this life, as Emma suffered repeated setbacks, Sean finally stepped forward as her loyal follower. In my usual blunt fashion, I declared to Sam, Jonathan and Emma have to stay together. Sam looked at me, baffled. Why? I raised an eyebrow and replied, does Sean's widowed mother know her son is planning to be Emma's backup plan? Sam's eyes widened, then lit up with understanding. Got it, Sarah. I know what to do. Sam and his buddies soon dug up the details of Emma and Sean's rendezvous, a secluded spot in a quiet grove. Meanwhile, I had someone slip a love letter under Jonathan's pillow in his dorm. The letter, written in the voice of a secret admirer, was saccharine to the point of being nauseating, dripping with infatuation. The final line, however, was key. Perhaps there's a way to prevent your reassignment. Meet me at this location for more details. Jonathan, ever the narcissist, was thrilled. He convinced himself that his charms had won over some influential factory heiress. When he arrived at the grove, he found Emma waiting, dressed to the nines. Emma, her hair styled into neat braids, wore a white sweater and a pink skirt, paired with gleaming black leather shoes, clearly an attempt to recreate the look of a famous movie star from a poster. Emma, why are you here? Jonathan asked, confused. Emma, equally surprised, snapped, why are you here? Leave, quickly. As they awkwardly argued, Sean arrived, furious. Whether out of a desire to defend Emma's honor or to protect his own claim on her, Sean lunged at Jonathan and began pummeling him. I've waited so long for Emma to notice me, and now you're here to ruin it again. Who gave you the right? Sean yelled. Before long, a fourth group joined the chaos. Sean's widowed mother and a troop of middle-aged women stormed onto the scene. You dare to hit my son? I'll fight you. Sean's mother shouted, rallying her group. What followed was a comical brawl. 5 or 6 of the women began hitting Jonathan, while 2 or 3 others turned on Emma, tearing at her clothes and dragging her forward for Sean's mother to slap. You witch! Sean's mother screamed. You've bewitched my son. Look at you. Wearing clothes bought with my son's hard-earned money. How dare you steal what isn't yours? You're no better than a thief. I should just kill you. That moment, Sam and his friends arrived as the 5th group. Whoa, Auntie! Sam shouted. What's going on here? What thief? What stealing? Let's calm down and sort this out. Meanwhile, someone in the factory shouted down the main road. Hey, there's a thief caught stealing in the grove. And now there's a fight. Come take a look. True to form, a crowd quickly gathered, eager for gossip. By the end of the day, everyone in the factory knew the story. The police eventually arrived and concluded that it was all a misunderstanding. Since most of the participants were middle-aged women, no serious action was taken. Everyone was let off with a warning. Jonathan, covered in bruises and clearly humiliated, didn't dare linger in town any longer. Before dawn, he left for his reassignment at the transport line. Emma, on the other hand, ended up in the hospital. This time, her situation truly earned her the reputation of being pitiful. Sean, however, wasn't so lucky. He was given an official reprimand, effectively ruining his chances of promotion. His mother was furious, lamenting, "If you hadn't been so fixated on that witch, you wouldn't have lost this opportunity." Remembering the gifts and money Sean had given Emma, his mother began dragging her friends to the hospital daily, loudly denouncing Emma and her actions. The spectacle was so overwhelming that Emma's mother didn't even dare to visit the hospital anymore. And so, Emma stayed hospitalized, now truly the object of widespread pity and disdain. I made a point to visit Emma in the hospital, not out of kindness, but purely to watch the drama unfold. Her face was swollen and bruised from the beating, and she developed an allergic reaction, leaving her bandaged up like a pig's head. Are you happy now? Emma asked, her eyes glaring at me with a venomous intensity. I smiled, savoring the moment. I'm helping you, Emma. Now the whole world knows that 2 men fought to the death over you. Your name is more famous than ever. Why aren't you thrilled? Oh, wait. You're worried about your reputation? What's that compared to the benefits you've gained? Haven't you hurt others enough to get where you are? She didn't respond, her lips trembling as she held back tears. But I'm curious, I continued, feigning innocence. Jonathan owes your family a great debt of gratitude. So why is it that, when you're at your lowest, he abandons you? Emma clenched her fists tightly, her body stiff as if holding back an emotional breakdown. Her reputation was in tatters. Her job was gone, and her aging mother had no energy left to fight for her. With her face scarred and her mother unable to provide support, finding another fool to bankroll their lives seemed impossible. After being discharged from the hospital, Emma didn't waste any time. She went straight to the transport line to find Jonathan. Jonathan wasn't faring much better. The factory's punishment had finally caught up with him. His pay was slashed, and he was stuck with the most menial labor. Once used to being admired and respected wherever he went, he now faced constant mockery from the rough workers he had always looked down upon. His spirit was on the verge of collapse. Emma's arrival was like a beam of light piercing through the gloom. Despite the scars on her face, she still carried a youthful charm that soothed Jonathan's battered soul. The 2 quickly decided to marry. Life on the transport line was harsh, so they returned to Jonathan's village to hold the wedding. His parents were livid. A university graduate like Jonathan, even in his current situation, still had a chance to rebuild his career. Marrying an unemployed woman with a scarred face was beyond their comprehension. But Emma wasn't one to be underestimated. During her visits to the villagers, she spread stories of how her father, a man who had once been exiled to the countryside, had taught Jonathan to read and write, thus laying the foundation for his education. The villagers were moved, praising Jonathan as a young man who knew how to repay kindness. Jonathan's parents, though uncomfortable with the flattery, were left with no choice but to accept Emma as their daughter-in-law. The wedding day, however, was the true spectacle. Lisa traveled overnight on a bumpy bus, arriving at the village exhausted and dizzy. But instead of being greeted warmly, she was led to an empty house and locked inside. "Lisa, it's for everyone's good," Jonathan told her through the door. "Mom and Dad are getting older, and the situation with me and Emma at the factory doesn't need to be spread around. I'll let you out after the wedding." Lisa was stunned. She never imagined Jonathan could be so petty as to imprison his own sister just to protect his reputation. The wedding itself was extravagant, drawing everyone from nearby towns, including the village chief and local officials. But just as the couple was about to bow to the heavens and the earth, Emma's mother burst into the courtyard, yelling, "Stop the wedding. You can't get married. Your father is still alive." The crowd fell silent, stunned. Emma's mother held up a newspaper, her face alight with excitement, pointing to a dark photo of a man's head. She exclaimed, "Look, that's him. Your father is alive, and he's a wealthy businessman in Hong Kong. He's in Beijing for a conference." And the newspaper reported it. I recognized it immediately. The crowd stared at the newspaper. But aside from the fact that the wealthy man shared Emma's last name, there was no visible evidence of any familial connection. Someone snorted loudly, their laughter piercing the silence. "Is this some kind of crazy get-rich-quick scheme?" they jeered. Jonathan's parents were particularly embarrassed. They hadn't wanted Emma as a daughter-in-law to begin with. "If you're not happy about this, let's call off the wedding," Jonathan's father said cautiously. But Emma, panicking, dropped to her knees. "Mom, Dad, your daughter-in-law is begging you," she cried. "My mother was just confused for a moment. But you can't abandon me. Not with the baby I'm carrying." Her sudden confession of being pregnant caused an uproar among the guests. It was the conservative 1980s, and such news was a moral bombshell. The village chief and other local officials turned green with embarrassment. Without bothering with excuses, they left the event immediately. Emma's mother wailed, beating her chest in despair. "Emma, you'll regret this someday." Jonathan's parents exchanged helpless glances. "We already regret it." Their expressions seemed to scream. Jonathan, meanwhile, was too overwhelmed by the escalating drama to say anything at all. Lisa and I watched the whole debacle from a nearby hill, concealed among the trees. The scene was such a farce that I nearly laughed myself to tears. If it weren't for Lisa's stoic presence beside me, I might have. "This is ridiculous," Lisa muttered, exasperated. "Let's go." Emma's mother wasn't wrong, though. Jonathan's oft-mentioned benefactor, Emma's father, really was alive. That newspaper had been placed in Emma's mailbox by none other than me. In the 1970s, Emma's father, Mr. White, had fled to Hong Kong, where he worked his way up from nothing to become a wealthy businessman. Since the 1980s, he had made several attempts to locate his wife and daughter in the mainland. But what he found shocked him. Emma's mother had been involved with several men and had even remarried. This left Mr. White conflicted. He could understand Emma's mother's actions as a means of survival, but he wasn't sure if Emma was truly his biological daughter. It wasn't until the 1990s, when DNA testing became more accessible, that Emma was confirmed as his child. She was brought to Hong Kong, where she wasted no time embracing her new life. Emma didn't even bring her mother with her when she left. In Jonathan's eyes, Emma's transformation was magical. She went from being the fragile, pitiable woman he cared for to the unattainable princess he could only dream of. Unable to reach her, Jonathan was heartbroken, so much so that he showed up at my door, begging for forgiveness. "I'll make it right this time," he said. "Let's start over and live a good life together." I slammed the door in his face with a resounding bang. "Forgive you? Hell no. Divorce me if you want. Or stay married. But you'd better deposit next month's household expenses as usual. You wronged me, and I'll happily spend every penny of your money." Even my son scolded me. "Mom, you're so petty." Around the turn of the millennium, Emma returned. Her father had passed away, and while his children in Hong Kong were all brilliant and capable, Emma didn't stand out among them. She was given a sum of money and effectively cast out. For reasons unknown, she couldn't make it in Hong Kong and returned to the mainland. By then, Jonathan, who had once promised to live a good life with me, had reunited with Emma. This time, he even brought my teenage son to meet her. My son was enamored with Emma, praising her beauty, gentleness, and apparent wealth. His respect for me dwindled further with each passing day. When I confronted Emma, accusing her of always taking what belonged to others, my son cut me off. Aunt Emma doesn't need to take anything. I want her to be my mom. We're not related by blood, but she treats me so well. Isn't that proof of how kind and wonderful she is? Apparently, he'd even told Emma about his mediocre grades. He even offered to pay for me to study in the US. Mom, he said, all you do is control me and force me to study. What else can you give me? You only have an elementary school education, and you're not even half as capable as Dad. That earned him a hard slap across the face. Clutching his cheek, he screamed, how did I end up with a mom like you? In my next life, I'm going to be Aunt Emma's child. My relationship with my son deteriorated rapidly. After he failed his college entrance exams, Emma didn't follow through on her promise to send him to the US for university. Instead, she encouraged him to settle for a technical college. I tried persuading him to retake the exams after a year of preparation, but he snapped back. What do you know? You stupid woman with your elementary school diploma? Aunt Emma says Dad's the factory director, so everything here will be mine to inherit someday. I don't need to work hard. The best thing for a young man like me is to enjoy life. Watching my son grow lazier and more entitled by the day broke my heart. Eventually, I retired early and shut myself away, focusing on my own life. Meanwhile, Emma and Jonathan paraded around together as if they were married, with Emma shamelessly playing the role of the factory director's wife. Many people felt sorry for me, but all I could do was bring up divorce again. Jonathan refused. You're like a fisherman, he said. Emma and I are connected on a spiritual level, not in any material way. You already have the legal status of being my wife. What more do you want? You should be content. Emma chimed in with a sanctimonious tone. I'm not trying to break up your family. I just want to join it. Of course, I have my own home too. If you ever feel left out, you're welcome to come to my house anytime. I was speechless. How could someone dress up shameless infidelity in such noble and refined words? Every time I saw those two, I beat them so badly they ran for their lives. Perhaps it was the constant frustration that defined my life. Just over 50, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. My treatment was half-hearted. I didn't care much about living anymore. Not long after, I passed away. In my wake, my son stood before my shrouded body, crying tears of joy. Finally, he said, now Dad and Aunt Emma can be together without any obstacles. Emma and Jonathan embraced each other right there in front of my remains, shedding tears of relief and happiness. They celebrated their newfound freedom, certain that their suffering had come to an end and their rightful union was within reach. My spirit was enraged. I wanted to leap at them and tear them apart, but in the blink of an eye, I woke up reborn. After being reborn, I gained a new perspective on many things that had tormented me in my past life. Jonathan's obsession with Emma wasn't about love. It was about her wealth and the opportunities her background provided. Back then, Emma's family wouldn't have allowed her to marry a second-hand factory manager from the mainland. Jonathan, knowing he couldn't marry up, clung to me to maintain his facade as a loyal husband. He kept me shackled in our broken marriage, using his influence to block me from leaving. This way, he could preserve his reputation while continuing to exploit me emotionally, financially, and professionally. When Emma returned years later, her priorities had shifted. She enjoyed Jonathan's care but also wanted to maintain her image as a single, eligible heiress to attract better prospects. Binding herself to Jonathan wasn't her goal. She wanted both worlds. By the year I developed breast cancer, Emma had burned through most of her inheritance and failed to find someone better than Jonathan. Only then did the two of them reunite after my death, each with their own selfish motives. Jonathan built his reputation as a devoted and long-suffering husband, while Emma gained full access to his assets under the guise of their union. Both got what they wanted, basking in their happy ending. And me? My entire life had become nothing more than the foundation for Jonathan's fame, and the contrast that elevated Emma's perfect image. In this life, I made sure to bind those two scumbags, Jonathan and Emma, together early on. cutting off all their opportunities for career advancement and financial growth. I can't help but wonder how much chaos Emma will bring to the Jonathan family once she discovers her identity as the daughter of a wealthy tycoon. For now, I'll let them enjoy a few years of peace before it all comes crashing down. The day I returned to the city happened to be Lisa's birthday. Mr. Lee went all out and got her a romantic cream cake topped with fresh flowers. It had been years since I'd seen a cake like that. As the lights dimmed and the candles were lit, Lisa made a wish. She spoke in Russian before blowing out the candles. Mr. Lee, turning the lights back on, asked, "What did you say in Russian just now?" Lisa looked at me deeply and replied, "As long as someone understands, that's enough. Now, let's cut the cake." Tears welled up in my eyes. "To the best Lisa in the whole world. May you live a long life." I had understood the Russian phrase she spoke. How can you hold a gift when your hands are full of trash? Lisa had always known what I was doing. Many of the plans I had executed were far from flawless. It was Lisa who quietly covered for me. I had been reborn, and so many unresolved emotions weighed on me like a boulder pressing against my chest. I was suffocating with hate and regret. But now it was time to selectively let go of some of that burden. I returned to my studies, earning a teaching certification and later passing entrance exams for higher education. Eventually, I left the comfortable confines of the factory and moved to Beijing. During that time, Lisa was also in Beijing for a training program. At Jonathan's wedding years ago, I had freed Lisa from the locked room where he had confined her. From that moment on, we became close friends. Together, we visited the places we had promised to see in our past lives but never managed to go. The White Pagoda, the Forbidden City, Tiananmen Square. I couldn't bear to tell her about her previous life, how her family had arranged for her to marry a man who appeared honest but was secretly abusive. She had endured horrific domestic violence, locked in her home repeatedly, without escape. The man's family was well off, but he harbored a dark secret. He was impotent. Jonathan knew this and did nothing to help his sister. "Sister," he had said, "even though Emma and I have no love left, we've stayed married because divorce is shameful, disgraceful, and subject to ridicule. No matter the reason, you must stay in your marriage too." In the end, Lisa could no longer endure it. She killed the man and then took her own life. After my rebirth, I feared Lisa would cross paths with that man again. But fate had other plans. The man had fallen off a mountain and been mauled by wild animals. His body left unrecognizable. In this life, Lisa never returned to the Jonathan family after leaving on Jonathan's wedding day. Jonathan, however, never gave up on his ambitions to return to the factory's main office. He wrote letters to Lisa, begging her to help him, but she ignored him. Things escalated when Jonathan and Emma had a child. The baby was born with an unusual condition. It couldn't digest any normal food. Jonathan's parents were beside themselves, shouting at Emma in the hospital, "What kind of curse have you brought to our family? Look at what you've given birth to." The baby's condition turned out to be a physical defect. It was born without an anus. The situation became the talk of the town. Jonathan begged Lisa for money to pay for the child's surgery. And despite her reluctance, she had no choice but to hand over her hard-earned savings. The child survived the surgery but became infamous, earning the nickname No Butt. During our time in Beijing, Lisa brought a photo of the child to show me. One look at the picture, and I couldn't help but laugh. The child looked exactly like my son from my past life. "Well," I said, stifling laughter, "it seems he's finally become Aunt Emma's son after all. I hope he successfully learns to poop." Lisa burst into laughter, watching me double over in hysterics. "You're still holding a grudge?" Lisa teased, watching me laugh so hard that I nearly tipped over. "Why would I remember disgusting things like that?" I replied, "What truly makes me happy is living better than others." After parting ways with Lisa, I headed straight to the TV station. The backstage area was a whirlwind of activity as everyone prepared for the evening's gala. I was ushered into makeup and given my performance outfit. As I waited in the hallway for my turn, I hummed the lyrics to my upcoming song over and over in my head. Meanwhile, back at the factory dormitory, Mr. Lee was eagerly waiting by the television. "It's been hours. Lisa, when is she coming on?" he asked impatiently. Lisa scolded him. "Why are you in such a hurry? This is a major national gala with countless veteran performers. It's her first time performing. Being a little late is normal. Despite her calm words, Lisa clutched a tin of cookies tightly, her nerves betraying her. A few neighbors had gathered in the small living room, all anxiously waiting for a familiar face to appear on the screen. In a remote, wind-chilled village, the scene was entirely different. The only television in the village belonged to the mayor, and many residents had bundled up in thick coats and gathered in his home to watch the gala. Among them was Jonathan, who took a drag from his cigarette only to cough violently. "This cigarette is trash," he muttered. "Nowhere near the quality I used to have at the main office." Since being transferred to the transport line, Jonathan had been forced to adapt to his new surroundings, including the low-quality cigarettes his co-workers smoked. He pitied them, thinking, these men probably haven't even dreamed of good cigarettes their entire lives. A villager struck up a conversation. "Jonathan, when are you going back to the main office? And why didn't your sister come home for the new year?" Another chimed in mockingly. "Maybe he's too busy looking after that kid of his. You know, the one born without." The room erupted in laughter. Jonathan, unable to bear the ridicule, lunged at the men, but as someone who fancied himself a scholar, he was no match for the burly farmers and was quickly knocked to the ground. Suddenly, the television volume was turned up, and the sound of the announcer's voice boomed through the room. "And now, please welcome the young singer Chloe Anderson performing The Birch Forest." Jonathan's eyes shot open wide. Who is that? It can't be her." Back in the dormitory, Mr. Lee let out a triumphant cheer. "That's my daughter. That's my Chloe. She's amazing." Lisa elbowed him sharply. "Shut it, will you? Chloe's singing." Mr. Lee clasped his hands over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. The neighbors were equally stunned, some trembling with excitement. Outside, a commotion began as people rushed to spread the news. "Turn on the TV. Or the radio if you don't have one. Chloe's on TV," shouted a young man as he darted through the dormitory corridors. The factory residents were floored. "Chloe? A star? Our Chloe. In my past life, I had always loved singing, but no one believed I had any talent. After marriage, my husband and child crushed what little confidence I had left. You're a mother now. Focus on your family. Mom, you sound awful when you sing." This life took a different turn. One night, while studying at a teaching college in Harbin, I went out for barbecue with friends. After a few drinks, I spontaneously belted out the Fifth Ring Road song. A man at a nearby table listened intently and said, "You've got an interesting voice. Want to come to Beijing and try singing professionally?" I recognized him immediately. He would later become one of the most renowned talent managers in the music industry. With nothing to lose, I agreed. If singing didn't work out, I could always start a small business in Beijing. Once there, I enrolled in classes with a renowned vocal coach, learning the fundamentals from scratch. Slowly but surely, I earned opportunities to perform on stage, one after another. In 1990, I stood on the stage of the nationally televised gala, singing The Birch Forest, a song that would take the entire country by storm. My singing career soared, marking the beginning of my golden era. People praised me, saying I had a defiant yet fearless quality, a kind of resilience that captured hearts everywhere. In the entire entertainment industry, I became known for being truly one of a kind. Honestly, it wasn't due to any special tricks. I just found joy in singing loudly, partly to maintain my breast health. My career kept me so busy that I didn't even realize I had become someone's cherished memory until the early 2000s. That year, Lisa and Mr. Lee retired. I went to pick them up and bring them to live with me in Beijing. As we entered the factory compound, I had bundled myself up like a rural grandmother visiting the city for the first time. Lisa scoffed. "Why are you sneaking around? Just wait. A crowd will chase after you for autographs and photos." She wasn't wrong. A young boy suddenly darted toward me, shouting, "Mom, I know it's you. Take me away." I was wrong. Lisa and I instinctively stepped back. "Who's your mom? Why are you calling me that?" I asked, startled. Just then, an elderly woman with white hair, Mrs. White, rushed up and grabbed the boy. "You heartless brat. Your real mother isn't dead yet, and you're calling someone else mom?" That's when I realized who the boy was. But I had no intention of acknowledging him. The boy cried, tears streaming down his face. Mom, you gave birth to me. How could I become White Auntie's son? Mom, Dad's a vegetable now. And it's all White Auntie's fault. We're so poor we can't even afford to eat. But she won't give us any money. She even blamed Dad for ruining her chance to go back to Hong Kong to claim her inheritance. Mom, please save me. Mrs. White raised her arm and slapped the boy hard several times. You ungrateful wretch. Shut your mouth. The more I listened, the clearer everything became. But the boy broke free from her grip, fell to his knees before me, and cried, Mom, I was wrong. Please forgive me. I opened my mouth slightly, unable to say a word, but the boy seemed to sense something. You still recognize me, don't you, Mom? I knew you wouldn't abandon me. Before I could respond, Lisa's brother, Robert, arrived with a team of workers. Seeing them, the boy's bravado disappeared. He bolted upright and ran, shouting, I'm not going to a mental hospital. I'm not sick. The workers quickly chased after him. Lisa, stern-faced, reprimanded Mrs. White. I told you to admit him to the hospital long ago, but you kept hesitating. Do you want him to end up like his father? Mrs. White, unable to say a word, wiped away tears. Lisa finally noticed me and said, I'm sorry you had to witness this. Then she turned to deal with the situation. Mrs. White followed behind the restrained boy, still crying. As they left, back at the old dormitory, Mr. Lee stood overseeing the workers as they stacked piles of luggage. I looked at him curiously and asked, was that boy just now really White Mabel and Jonathan's child? Lisa, watching the workers move boxes, replied flatly, yes, that was him. He's been suffering from auditory hallucinations since he started speaking. He should have started school by now. But the condition comes and goes. She continued, remember when Mrs. White claimed the boy's father was some Hong Kong tycoon? Turns out, he was telling the truth. A couple of years ago, the tycoon even came looking for him. He acknowledged the child but only gave them a lump sum payment and promised a fixed monthly allowance. But after learning about her biological father, White Mabel became obsessed. Every day, she would rant about the fortune he owned, demanding to go to Hong Kong. Everyone knew if she went, she'd never come back. Jonathan probably hoped to strike it rich by going with her, so he constantly contacted people in Hong Kong. The response from the Hong Kong side was clear. They said Mr. White Sr.'s health was too poor to entertain guests. They even used the word entertain to refer to his own daughter. But White Mabel didn't care. She believed the Lee family was deliberately blocking her from going to Hong Kong. She and Jonathan fought constantly. Hearing this, I couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity of it all. That boy's mental state grew worse and worse. He would point at the TV and insist that I was his real mother. White Mabel lashed out at Jonathan, accusing him of still having feelings for me and accidentally letting it slip in front of the boy. Jonathan, shockingly, admitted he regretted everything. If I hadn't sided with White Mabel back then, would we have ended up like this? Would I have been stuck on the transport line for so many years, unable to return to headquarters? It's all because of her that I offended people I never should have crossed. Otherwise, I'd be the husband of a superstar by now. His delusions knew no bounds. In a fit of rage, White Mabel smashed Jonathan into a vegetative state. His parents, devastated by the incident, both fell ill and passed away within a year. Jonathan became no different from a living corpse, leaving only the no-exit boy behind in the Lee family. I asked, and what about White Mabel? Lisa answered, she's locked up. Lawyers from Hong Kong are trying to get her sentence reduced. As for Mrs. White, she's dreaming of following the lawyers back to Hong Kong. But Mr. White Sr. remarried twice in Hong Kong, and Mrs. White herself remarried here. How could they possibly let her go to Hong Kong? They've just given her some money for retirement and nothing more. Lisa wrapped it up succinctly. It's all a complete mess. I couldn't help but marvel at the chaos. I had always known that Jonathan and White Mabel wouldn't live peacefully for long after getting together. I also knew White Mabel would cause a huge ruckus upon discovering her noble lineage. But I didn't expect it would end in tragedy. Lisa added, now, I hear that Lisa has become the deputy factory manager. She's busier than ever and still has to take care of that boy. Honestly, when White Mabel gets out, we should just return the child to her and let them do as they please. In this life, the factory director highly valued Lisa. After working in the general office for a year, she was recommended to study in Beijing. From then on, she attended all significant events, gradually climbing the ranks. She went back to college and rose through the ranks, becoming the successor groomed by the factory director. After he retired, Lisa directly took over as deputy director, steering the state-owned factory through the tides of privatization and emerging as a celebrated businesswoman of the 2000s. Interestingly, all these achievements originally belonged to Jonathan in my previous life. Now, they had returned to Lisa. Thinking about it, it felt like karma balancing the scales. Walking out of the old dormitory, Lisa pointed to a new high-rise community in the distance. That's the new staff housing complex. Aunt Lee lives on the 10th floor and rides the elevator every day. She's thrilled. That's great, I replied. Mr. Lee added, many families have already moved there. Even Mrs. Xiao, the one who brought her relatives to the scene back then, is now helping maintain order and cleanliness in the community. She's very popular. I couldn't help but laugh, remembering Mrs. Zhao's commanding presence back in the day. As we walked, several people greeted me, and I responded with polite smiles. One woman was particularly bold and exclaimed, "So you're the famous singer from TV. I can't believe I'm seeing you in person." She introduced herself. "I'm Tanya. Remember me?" I immediately perked up. "Of course. Tanya, how have you been?" Unfazed, Tanya replied, "I've been transferred to headquarters. Working in the office now. What about you? Are you married yet?" "I married an officer," she added. "A tall and handsome one." I laughed. "I can't compete with you. With so many options. You must have had a hard time choosing." Tanya's laughter was tinged with pride and a hint of shyness. "Well, when you get married, make sure to invite me." "Of course," I replied. Good things should be shared with good people. Tanya's expression softened into something unexpectedly bashful. Soon, Charles honked from the driver's seat of a car waiting by the factory's new main gate. My parents and I climbed in. "Hey, sis," Charles said. "You haven't been back in so long. Let me take you around for a bit." I shook my head. "No time for sightseeing. I have a flight to catch tomorrow. There's a concert in Haicheng." Sitting beside me, Lisa stroked my hand. "I always knew your hands weren't meant for holding pins. I guess they might be for tools, but I never thought they'd be for holding a microphone." I replied in Russian. And here we are. We exchanged a smile, while Mr. Lee dozed peacefully in the front passenger seat. The sunlight filtered through the windows, filling the car with a serene warmth, wrapping us all in a lazy contentment.